everyone, Annette with Sheridan Art and Designs. Welcome to part 4 of Tanjiro's Haori. In this video, we'll be constructing the sleeve and the lining.
Okay, we have all of our pieces cut out and the interfacing fused on, and now it's time to start assembling the lining for the Haori. So here I have the back and front piece. This is the shoulder seam with the neckline, and I'm going to put together the center back seam. And while I'm at it, what I am going to do, just because I like to kind of work on a production line manner, it's just more efficient for me. I will also take at the end, this is the back, and it goes into the front here at the shoulder seam where the neckline is. So you can get that to lay flat. All right. So then we have our neckline, and this would be the front of the Haori. And what I'm going to do is I'll pin the back of the center back of the Haori, and then I'll also take the front lower lining pieces and attach those to each of the bottom of the fronts at the same time. So I'm going to pin all of this together and then take it over to machine and stitch these two seams, the center back seam, and then the front and back will be complete, and then that'll be ready for pinking and pressing. Now you can have a choice of, because this is lining and we want to minimize the amount of shadowing coming through. When you do stitch a seam there, you will see your seam allowance just ever so slightly. And so you have a choice there. You can either use your pinking shears and trim that down to about 1/4 inch, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and the pinking shears will prevent any fraying on the seam allowance, so you should be fine there. Or you can serge the edges. If you don't have a serger, you can just use a zigzag stitch on the edge of your seam allowances. So you'll put those seam allowances together. Don't press them open. You could serge the edges of them with it open, but if you're going to do serging or zigzagging on the edge of your seam allowances, just keep them together. So yeah, you would keep them together like this, and then you would zigzag the edges right after you stitch them, and then you would press both seams to the side, just like we did on the Haori when we were making the patchwork. You're going to keep the seams together and then press them flat to one side. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and start preparing my center back seam. Okay, the next thing to prepare is the sleeve construction. So I have sleeve, and then I also have the sleeve lining here. And so we'll do these at the same time. The first thing to do is to we'll do our sleeve first. Get the lining out of the way. And then we're just going to turn this right sides together. And we're going to be stitching the lower portion of the sleeve. So going from this edge here in the corner all the way around the curve and stopping at the square. You can see I have my markings here. This is for the outer edge, and then this is where we'll stop for the sleeve insertion. All right, so we'll be going back to the nesting of the seams. and pinning, and I'm just matching up my raw edges and those seams, just lining those up so that they will nest up properly, give me good clean lines. And I've got one there. And I'm just going to put a pin right there at the square to remind me to stop so I don't stitch all the way up. And then just lining up the bottom raw edges and nesting these seams so that they line up nicely. All right, and that sleeve is ready to go. So again, we're going to stitch from here around the curve and stop at the square. And then I'm going to prepare the lining the same way. Right sides together. Okay, we've got all of our seams stitched, and now we're ready to get them trimmed down. So you can see here, this is the body of the Haori lining, and I've already set my seam with my iron, and then I just pinked the seam allowance. I used my pinking shears. And because this fabric, you can see, is very, there you can see that it is very likely to fray. And so I just want to make sure that all of that doesn't happen on the inside of my garment. So I've pinked the seams. So the two front seams and then the center back seam as well. So the body of the Haori is ready for pressing those seams, and I'll probably press them open because I've trimmed them to 1/4 inch, so it's not going to be very much shadowing at all. On the sleeves, I used both my pinking shears and my snips, because coming around this turn, the first thing I did was pink the edge all the way around. And all the way around on both the sleeve and on the lining, treated them exactly the same. But then I also took some bigger snips. You can see these bigger V cuts. I took some bigger snips with my snips and clipped the curve, so that when I flip it open, it will lay more flat. And I can show you what I mean by that. So when I turn this right side out, And I haven't pressed the seam yet, so it'll still be a little bit bulky, but you'll get the idea. So now that I have my sleeve turned inside out, this is the seam that I'll go over and press, but that we just stitched and that I've clipped. And you can see by clipping that, it gives you a nice flat curve without any puckering or pulling around that curved space. So that's why we do those V snips around all corners like that. All right, so that's the sleeves, and these two are ready to go. I'll actually do a couple for you. I left one seam and a lining so that you can see. It is very simple to do. I'm going to do my pinking first. So I'm just trimming the seam allowance down to about 1/4 of an inch. This is my stitching line. I know that's very hard to see because it's white on white on white, but this is my stitching line. So I'm just cutting it about 1/4 inch off of that seam line because I don't need to have all of that extra fabric and bulk in the seam for when I flip it. Now just coming up on the curve, I'm just going to make sure I have a nice smooth cut around the curve. And pinking shears are a little harder to use. You do have to kind of muscle them a little bit, especially if you're going through a seam, like on the sleeve. I'll show you when we're cutting through those 4 layers of that patchwork. You have to kind of muscle it a little bit. But just on 2 layers like this, it's very easy. And I'm just going to pink all the way up to my square there. Right there, and then I'm just going to cut it off to the side. So you can see I didn't take very much off, just enough to cut it down to the 1/4 inch, and I have a nice pinked edge there. Now I'm going to take my snips, and you don't have to snip on the straight edge, it's only around the curve piece. So going into the curve, I'm going to make a snip there, and it is just a little larger V cut. So you can see that one. And I'm doing them about 3/4 of an inch because this is a fairly gentle curve. If it was a really tight curve, then I might shrink that down to about every 1/2 inch or so, just so that I got when I turned it, it was nice and flat. And you can test it if you want to do them about every inch or 3/4 of an inch, and then if it's still puckering a little bit, just go ahead. Now you can see when I'm snipping, this right here is my seam. So I'm not going all the way to the seam line. I'm off. This is my seam, my stitch right there. So I'm going close to, but not touching my stitches. Because you don't want to damage that seam. I'll just do one last one here before we hit the straight edge. And that's clipping your curves. And then that one's ready to press. And you can see, I'll turn this one so you can see. I still have the side panels yet to insert, but I wanted to take a measurement against the outer Haori. So I'll do that before I put my side panels in. But then the side panels will go in to the body, and then I'm going to do what's called bagging the lining. There we go. So you can see we have a nice, get that pressed out, and we've got a nice curve there. Yep. And I'll do the same thing for that last remaining sleeve. So bagging the lining is when you construct the entire lining and then attach it to the garment and leave an opening to turn it right side out. And then you slip stitch the clothes. Okay, now that we have our sleeves and linings constructed, it's time to put them together. So I've done one already to show you what it's going to look like. And again, we're off pattern here because the traditional Haori has a facing that attaches here, but because Tanjiro's does not, we're not going to do that. We're going to do what's called bagging our lining. And for this particular piece, I'm actually going to put the lining in first, and then we'll attach the sleeve to the Haori in the next step. So get this finished one out of the way so you can see I've stitched the lining around here and turned them both right sides out, and we've got our lining inside, so ready to go. This one is finished and ready to attach to the Haori. So how did we do that? We have our lining turned right side out. Seams have been pressed and clipped. Everything's good. And then we have our outer sleeve where I've pressed the seams open here. And this is right side in or wrong side out. All right. So then all we do is we're going to put right sides together. So right side of the lining goes to right side. So we're going to just tuck it right inside the sleeve. Right sides together. Just going to make sure that's laying nice and flat. And you can even just pick it up, and this is the edge that we're going to be stitching. So you want to make sure you have it nice and flat. Everything's lined up. Okay. This back just a little bit. So we've got our edges matched up, and then I'm just going to pin those. Now this will be a little bit tricky because you do have the end seam of your lining here, and you have and then we're going to stitch right to that, but that's okay. It might look like it's going to pucker at first, but we're going to do some clips right there after we stitch it. We'll clip that so it turns nice and lays flat. So essentially what we're going to do is going to pick up from this seam allowance here, right? So we're going to follow along. That's where we stopped at the curve, and we're going to pick up right there, but we're not going to sew the two edges of the sleeve together. Instead, we're just going to sew one edge and the lining together so that we're making that the opening for the hand. So we're just going to turn that seam allowance up so I can get it to lay flat for when I'm stitching. That will help with the puckering. There we go. Get my finger under there and make it lay flat. All right. Everything else is lined up and we're good to go. I'm just going to put a pin in there. To hold that open and flat. All right. And then just line up your edges and pin them. Okay, we're at the machine and we're going to stitch the lining to the sleeve. And so I'm just opening up here. This is where our stitching stopped when we were sewing the bottom portion of the sleeve. And so I'm just opening that up and getting it so that I can get my needle right in as close as I can there. And my needle's going down right where my stitching ended and picking that up. And I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, just making sure everything is nice and flat before I put my presser foot down. And then just sewing this in a loop, so you will have to continue to rotate this. We'll stop and start on opposite sides of the same spot. All right, so we have our lining stitched to our sleeve, and now before I give that a press, I'm just going to trim this down. So I want to pink the edges of this seam just so that it doesn't unravel too much. You can see this satin fabric really likes to fray. So the next thing to do is press out our sleeve and turn it. So we want to set this seam first so it blends just very nicely into, and this is not, I'm not moving the iron around or pressing real hard. It's literally just up and down, up and down. And I don't want, turn my iron down just a little bit. Because I have interfacing on here, I don't want to overheat that. If you overheat your fusible interfacing, what will happen is that the glue will get so hot that it will melt away. And then you will have what's called delamination, where there's no more glue left to hold the interfacing to the fabric. So you want to be careful about not overheating over, so use a lighter temperature iron. Does the same thing. All right, so I've set the seam all the way around. Feel good about that. And now it's time to turn our sleeve. Now we need this, the exact opposite of what it is. So just pull the two apart. So we have our two sleeves. Sleeve and lining. And now what we're going to do is just tuck the lining right into the sleeve. And that gets pushed down into the rounded corner there. All right. And just get everything laying flat on the inside, making sure everything is lined up nicely. My rounded corner is staying rounded and tucking the lining in there. All right, so I've got some tools with me to do the pressing. This is the edge that we're going to be working on right here. And you can see that it's pretty loose, and what we want to do, I don't want to just press it like it is, because there's a lot of looseness going on there. So what we want to do is roll this so that the seam, so we're going to roll this so that we're actually pressing right where the seam is. And you can see I've taken almost a full inch back into the sleeve, right? Just rolling it back into the sleeve from the turn. And that's going to give us a nice crisp edge here. Now what we don't want to do is we don't want to roll it to the point where it's absolutely equal like that. What we're going to do is, as we roll our seam, we're going to roll the white one in just slightly. So you have, it's just about 1/8 of an inch, if you can see that. It's just about 1/8 of an inch. So we're pressing the seam actually into, on the interior, so that you've got this green and black 1/8 of an inch edge here. And so that way the lining will stay to the inside, and then when you see the outside, it's going to look like this, and your white lining won't show through. So that's what we're going to do. Now I'm going to use a couple of tools to help me with this. The first thing I have is my wool pressing mat. It will keep things nice and stable, and they won't slide around on my mat as I'm rolling and rolling this sleeve, just getting this edge down. All right, the first thing I'm going to do is just give it a light, this is where I want you to stay, right? Just a little bit of heat. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, I'll roll this back, and there's a lot of seams here, right? We've got the checkerboard seams, and then we also have this interior seam. So I'm using just a sheer pressing cloth. This is just a sheer piece of organza. I like the sheer because I can see what I'm doing through it, and yet it still helps keep the heat in where I need it. Okay. And I am steaming. very carefully. And then the next thing I'm going to do is take my clapper and lay my clapper right on that. And I'm just going to let that cool for a second. Now the pressing cloth will actually help keep some of that steam and heat in to the fabric. So it's going to take just a few seconds longer to cool. But what that does is it gives it a little extra time to really set. So you can see we have our nice seam pressed. And we'll do that on the other side, but what happens when we come around this curve? So it really is just, you can lay it flat here, or what I like to do is I have a pressing ham, and when I'm doing curves like this is a great tool for pressing your seams right on top of that. So it's still the same thing. Still going to press, roll, right? Still rolling that seam. Because if I were to just press right as I turned it and didn't roll this back to the seam, I would actually end up short on my sleeve down there because it had all rolled up this way. So you want to just be careful and mindful and take your time. And again, we're rolling that white right to the inside. And you can press this from the outer fabric or from the lining fabric. It really doesn't make a difference. Just giving it a little bit of steam, shaping that for around the shoulder. Just going to hold that steam in for just a second, and then the clapper. Just going to rock that around the curve, not pressing hard, just holding it in place, gentle rock. And we've got a beautifully pressed seam there. All right.
Thank you for watching. The Haori has come together and we are almost done. Stay tuned for part 5 as we do the final finishing. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Please stop by the comments section to say hi and feel free to ask any questions. I hope these videos are helping you learn new sewing skills in the world of cosplay and hopefully inspire you to create your own. If there are projects that you would like to see a video on, please let us know in the comments section. Until next time, be safe, be happy, and keep creating.
悲しみ